Welcome to Tavern Archery. I'm Johannes von Hammersbach, and after a day on the archery field, we come into the tavern, sit down, grab a pint, and talk about all things target archery. Prost.
They long had shot so well, and no wonder for truly they spend time gathered here. They spend time gathered here in Tavern Archery.
Today in the tavern, we're sitting down chatting with Baron Geoffrey von Ulm, Order of the Laurel from the Baron of Stierbach. And today we're going to spend a few moments chatting about the English warbow. Welcome, Baron.
It's good to be here.
Baron, can you tell us about your journey into the SCA and your passion for the English warbow?
Sure. I got started with archery long before I got into the SCA. Started archery when I was 10 years old and went to Boy Scout camp for the first time and found the archery range, loved it. When I got home, I convinced my mother to give me all of her quality stamps. Nobody remembers what quality stamps are anymore, but you used to get them at the grocery store instead of your rewards cards. You had stamps, and you got the stamps and you fill up books, and once you got enough books filled, you could get something from their catalog. And I got a bare green fiberglass cheap bow, a little 25-pound bow. And I took that out in the backyard. I got some hay bales and started shooting. And I shot constantly in the backyard. Finally, by the time I was 16, I guess my parents were feeling sorry for me. They got me a real bow, got a nice bare grizzly, and started shooting that. I finally found the SCA when I was 18. In 1978, I was taking a fencing class. And a friend of mine and I were having a chat during a break, and we were talking about these weirdos we had heard about who hang out in the park and put on armor and hit each other with sticks. And one of the guys in the class stepped over and said, "I know those people. In fact, I'm in a play with your king." Okay, so he gave us the information on the play and we went to it. It was a really bad production of The Hobbit. And sure enough, most of the cast were SCA, as well as all the weapons and armor had come from the local SCA group. And after the play, we went backstage, found our friend. He introduced us to John Fulton, known in the SCA as John the Bear Killer. Bear Killer was not king of Meridies at the time. He was actually crown prince for the second time. And John told me where to find fighter practice. And a day or two later, I showed up at fighter practice. And there were only two people at fighter practice other than me that day. Pat Owens put his armor on me. And the other guy, Lee Hares, Leto Dark Horse, proceeded to beat the stew out of me. And I came back and I brought my friends and I went to meetings. And it just became a lifelong hobby from there. And of course, I got into the SCA primarily for heavy combat, but I also shot. And early in the society, we didn't do a lot of archery, but as the society got older, we started doing more and more archery tournaments. Now, I was still a heavy fighter, but anytime I wasn't fighting, I'd run over the archery range and shoot, shot in a lot of tournaments, had a lot of fun with it. And eventually, a friend of mine and I, Kevin Gage, Ulam McUlam, better known to all of his friends as Waffle. And Waffle and I started our own archery practice. We started running archery events for the kingdom, became kingdom archery marshals, and even shot for the kingdom a few times at Penzic as the champions for Meridies. But how I ended up getting into the U-bow was in the society, we of course also have personas. And some people take personas far more seriously than others. Some people have multiple personas. But I had decided on 14th century German, and 14th century German who fought with the English in the 100 Years' War. The Germans fought on both sides, so I was one of the ones fighting for the English. Well, if you're going to study the 100 Years' War, you're of course going to come across the iconic weapon of the 100 Years' War, which was the U longbow. And being an archer and being interested in the 100 Years' War, I really wanted a U-bow, but it wasn't like you could just walk into some merchant and buy one back then. They were really hard to come by. And I used to stop and visit a merchant at Penzic every year, Yumi Bows, Jaap Koppendreyer. And I stopped into Jaap's booth one day And of course, being his booth is called Yumi Bows, he obviously specializes in Eastern, particularly Japanese bows. But he had a longbow on his rack one day. It was Osage orange. And I kept looking at that bow and looking at that bow, and I said, huh, can you make one of these out of yew? He said, well, sure. I said, how much? And he gave me a price. I think it was $300. And I was like, I just didn't have the $300. The next year I came in and asked him again. I think it had gone up to $400 the next year, and then $500. Just every time I asked him, it seemed like it went up about $100. And there finally came a point I said, make the bow. And he said, well, you can't be in a hurry. He says, this is going to take me a while. First, I got to find a stave, and then I'm going to have to season it, then I'll make the bow. And so you can't be in a hurry. I said, well, that's fine. I said, that'll give me time to make arrows that are worthy to be shot off of a yew longbow. I said, I've been making my own arrows for a long time. But it's a standard, SCA arrows, the wooden Port Oxford cedar arrows with plastic nocks. I said, I cannot shoot plastic nocked arrows off of a real yew bow. So I've got plenty of time to start doing my research. So that's really how I got into doing the research on arrows, was making arrows for this longbow. And eventually, Yop did deliver the bow. And I now have 2 yew longbows and have really gotten heavily into working with them.
Can you share your knowledge of the English warbow, how they were used in battle, and why is the yew bow so special?
Well, sure. Yew bows have been around for thousands of years. I mean, you and I talked about Ötzi the Iceman, and he died about 5,500 years ago, and he was found with a yew bow. And the reason is, yew is the perfect wood for making a self bow. When you try to make a bow, there are basically 2 different ways to make a bow. You can do a composite bow where you take different materials like horn and sinew, different types of wood, and you laminate them. You make a composite bow, and you choose the materials based on their resistance to compression, their resistance to stretching, to being stretched. And a lot of the Eastern bows, of course, are various forms of composite bows, and it makes very good bows. Your other way to make a bow is a self bow. A self bow is something that's made from a single piece of wood. And you can make a bow from any kind of wood, just some wood is better than others. What really makes yew exceptional is, I think it was Hardy referred to yew as being a self-laminated wood. And what he was talking about is with yew, you've got 2 different types of wood in the same tree. You've got the lighter color wood, which is the sap wood, which is right underneath the bark. That resists stretching. Then you've got the darker wood underneath, the heartwood, that resists compression. And so when you combine those together, you get the perfect wood for making a self bow. Now, sure, the Japanese would have been happy to have made yew longbows, except they didn't have yew. The Europeans did, particularly the Northern Europeans, had yew, and that's what they used. It was the best wood for making a self bow. They did have other types of bows, but if you're going to make a self bow, that was it. Now, we know Ötzi had used a yew bow. We also have yew bows from the Iron Age and from the Viking Age and all the way up to the Middle Ages. It's just the English had not really been making much use of bows in warfare up until the 13th century. And then when Edward I, while he was campaigning in Wales for various reasons, which we won't go into in this video, but while he was there, the Welsh were sniping at him with yew longbows. And he conceived the idea of collecting yew bows together and using them as a fighting unit, using them as a combined arms unit with his men-at-arms. And so if you start looking at his campaigns in Scotland, you'll see how he used his men-at-arms to pin the Scots in place and then bring up the archers to just destroy them. And whenever the English followed their battle plan, they were just devastating to the Scots. And then whenever the men-at-arms didn't follow the battle plan and decided to attack on their own, they usually got slaughtered. So really, Edward I is the one who first came up with this. Now, it really became an iconic weapon during the 100 Years' War. During the 100 Years' War, you got the English king who really should have inherited the French throne. The French did not give it to him. He declared that he was the king of France. And thus in 1337 began the 100 Years' War. Well, the first major battle of the war, the French were amassing a fleet at Sluys to invade England. The English pulled a preemptive strike and they attacked with their own fleet, and they would do one boat, one ship full of men-at-arms flanked by 2 ships of archers. And really this became the English formation throughout the 100 Years' War, that put the men-at-arms in the middle and put the archers on the flanks to support them. And we've all heard of Crécy with 1346 and Poitiers, 1348, and of course everybody's heard of Agincourt in 1415. Those are the big red letter battles, but they were just hundreds of other battles that were fought using the same formation, same tactics.
You mentioned Agincourt. Now, I understand we were talking earlier. You had the opportunity to go to the 600th anniversary of Agincourt and participate in the big shoot. Can you tell us about that experience?
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the best experiences I've had as a reenactor or a living historian to be able to do that. While I was researching my arrows, and of course I'm on websites and things all the time looking for any new information I can get, I ran across a post from a fellow in England who had conceived the idea of the big shoot for the 600th anniversary of Agincourt. And his vision was quite large. And it started out with, he wanted to get 1,000 archers on the field at Agincourt, dressed correctly with yew longbows, with the correct arrows, and do an arrow storm. And his vision went on from there. We're later going to put rubber tips on the arrows and have the French army march into us and have us do an arrow storm on them. And he had all kinds of other shoots planned for the weekend. It was a rather grand plan. Didn't work out quite the way he had planned, but we did finally do the big shoot. Well, of course, there's a lot to overcome being in the United States and wanting to go to a reenactment in France. My first problem was I had to convince my wife to go. That conversation amounted to, I want to go to France in 3 years. And she said, sure. She's lived in France twice. She speaks French. She loves going to France. So that really wasn't an obstacle. The real hurdle was, I'm going to reenactment and I'm SCA. Now I've done American Civil War reenacting, and I'm well aware that the standards for reenactment are a bit higher than what we have in the SCA. And I dressed pretty well for the SCA, but I knew there were things I was going to have to do to up my game to be able to participate in that reenactment. But I said, I got 3 years, I can do this. And I began getting my things together and had to get online and get on the message forums where they were discussing the rules and how things were going to be done. And there was a real groundswell, particularly from the United States, of people who were planning on going. A lot of people from the US and a lot of SCA people who were planning on going. There were so many SCA people going, somebody had started a forum for the SCA goes to Agincourt. Well, as we got closer and closer to the reenactment, of course, people started to drop out. There are a lot of logistical problems. There's cost. There's trying to get all your stuff over there to do a reenactment. And in my case, I knew I couldn't take camping things. All I could take was pretty much what the archer could have carried. I can carry my weapons, my clothes, a cloak, and I really couldn't take much with me. Well, fortunately, on the Agincourt goes to, on the SCA goes to Agincourt page, after we gotten down to it, turns out there were only 6 people still planning on going. There were 5 from a shire in Sweden and me. And they were really nice. Since they knew I was going alone, they invited me to come hang out with them, which I really appreciate. They were wonderful people. But the whole shire, all 5 of them, were a bunch of archers, and they were going. Well, as we got closer to the battle, so many things started going wrong with the reenactment. They had come up with, at one point, the museum, who was running the event, said we couldn't use hand-forged arrowheads for the shoots. And part of the problem with that was a lot of the people who were going were English Warbow Society and Dutch Warbow Society, Welsh Warbow Society, and they were required to use hand-forged arrowheads for their shoots. So a lot of people who were going weren't necessarily reenactors. They were longbow shooters who wanted to go to the event. and who were getting clothes together to go. And a lot of them got really angry and decided not to go, which really the reason the French didn't want us using hand-forged heads is if we lost one, they didn't want somebody finding it in 100 years and going, oh, I found an arrowhead from the battle. No, that was one somebody lost 100 years ago at the reenactment. So that caused a lot of heartache. And a lot of the rules, you know, what we had to wear as far as wool outer garments and no butted mail and just all the things, people would keep getting madder and madder, and more people would start to bail out on the event. And then right before the event happened, they came up with, well, they were only going to allow, for the big shoot, they were going to allow 100 of us to shoot at a time. The 100 people could step up to the line and shoot, and then they step back, and the next 100 would step up, and people's heads exploded. And they're saying, no, 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 no. The whole point of this is we want to do an arrow storm. We all want to shoot together. And what the problem really was the insurance company was not happy with having us all stacked up in a big block shooting steel arrows over each other's heads. And you think about that. If we went to Pinzik and said, we want to get all the archers together out on the battlefield and get, 1,000, 2,000 archers out there and all do an arrow storm, the SCA would never let us stand behind each other shooting. So this was a problem. Well, people were just started screaming and yelling. I really thought the French and English were going to go to war again. They were so angry with each other. And one fellow, just in the nick of time, a fellow named Nick Birmingham, an Englishman from the Free Company of Aquitaine, stepped up and said, everybody chill out. He didn't actually say chill out, but he told everybody relax. He's working on it. And he worked with the insurance company, worked with the organizers, and finally got permission to go ahead and do it. But he kind of became the captain of the archers, and then the rest of the Free Company of Aquitaine kind of became the sergeants, herding us all around, doing the inspections and things. Great people. I could not say enough good things about Nick and his folks. I finally got to the event. One of the things about getting there is having to travel with bows, swords, sharp pointy things, arrows, and some things like traveling through England. This is a real problem. I didn't go through England, I flew directly to France, but you're coming through England and you got to have paperwork showing you're going to or from a reenactment to carry all of that stuff with you. The French were a lot easier on it. And some of the advice I got, I talked to some people who had traveled to and from Europe, particularly France, with armor and weapons before, was they said, pack your things in regular sports bags. It says airlines know how to deal with, say, a golf club bag or a ski bag, but they wouldn't know how to deal with something else. So I managed to get me a hard ski case that I could pack my bows and swords and all my reenactor stuff in there and ship it. Then I packed all my helmet and gauntlets and things. I was going to put them in carry-on, which a lot of people have done. I ended up go ahead and checking those bags. But yes, TSA had a lot of fun with my bags for that event. I finally got to the event and found my folks. And it was incredible because it really reminded me of an SCA event, except everybody, we have a theme for the SCA event. So everybody's from the same time and everybody's dressed really well. But we had the English camp, we had the French camp, you had the battlefield, you had the archery range, you had a demonstration area, you had a merchant's row. And merchant's row, you go down and it was just like going down an SCA merchant's row. You could probably pick 2 or 3 dozen of the best merchants from Pinzik, and it looked pretty much like the merchant's row at Agincourt. And the people were great. I was really worried about going to a reenactment in France where we were reenacting one of the worst defeats in French history. I wasn't sure how they felt about that, having done American Civil War reenacting and knowing that some people take the American Civil War still a little too seriously. I wasn't sure how the French felt. The French were a bunch of history people. They were a bunch of geeks. They were having fun. It was just really, really wonderful experience. Well, after we got there, of course, first things we had to do, we had to get our bows inspected, then we had to go through and do rehearsals. So we had to rehearse the big shoot. And the way Nick had arranged this was he had his people lined up, his sergeants lined up, and they would stand at a point, and they would send the line of us out. The person would say, stand here. And then they'd take 2 steps, and the next person stand here, take 2 steps, the next person stand here. And they had 3 rows of people going all the way down the sides, and then staggered the lines in between. So I guess you could kind of say we were social distancing back before it was cool. But they got us all lined up and we went through the rehearsal. Everything went fine. Then we broke for lunch. Then we had to go out and practice for the reenactment. So long before the spectators got there, we had to get out on the field and practice walking through everything. And we had a guy on a PA system, which he was announcing for the benefit of the public, but really we're listening to it too to know when we're supposed to do various things. And one of the odd things is, you know, we're shooting rubber blunts, but European reenactors fight open face. Now they're all armored everywhere else, but even if they have a visor, when they're engaged in melee, they're required to have the visor up so they can see what's going on. Now this is a problem shooting arrows at somebody, because if you hit them in the face, you could really hurt somebody. So they had us fire all of our shots in volleys, and they would call the volleys ahead of time so the French could either put their visors down or tilt their heads into the thing or put a shield over their face, and we'd shoot our volleys, and then we would stop, then they could continue on with the melee. But after we'd gone through all the rehearsals, broke for the evening, that's when I took my chance to wander around the battlefield and wander over the memorial. They've got a memorial there for the French who died. In theory, some stories up to 10,000 French died. Some people think not so many. And in theory, they're buried under the memorial, which the excavations of the memorial have shown that they're not actually buried under there. In fact, turns out they're not sure exactly where the battle was. They know it was in this field. They just don't know where along this rather long field it was fought. Well, that night, the Swedes had invited me to go ahead and stay in the tent with them, which I was fine sleeping out on the battlefield. But it started to rain. Well, fortunately, they had a tarp, so I slept under the tarp. And then the wind started blowing. It started blowing the rain in sideways. So I kept having to move over further and further over the side of the tarp. And the tarp fell a few times. And for those who are familiar with the battle, they know it did actually rain the night before the battle. And it got muddy. Amazingly enough, the next morning, that field was very muddy. I had to compliment the French on having recreated the correct battle conditions for the reenactment. I was really impressed. Of course, did get a lot of sleep that night. But the next morning we got up and we did go ahead and do the big shoot, which it was fun. We got set up for it, and about 15 Frenchmen decided they were going to go out into the field and be targets for us. Now we were shooting with blunts, but that was one of the agreements with the insurance companies. We had to shoot with blunts since we're shooting over each other's heads. But they went down and played targets for us, which hats off to those guys. And you got some of the pictures of that. And I just don't know how to describe it. It was just incredibly cool to be out there with so many people dressed correctly, all of these U-bows, and doing an arrow storm. I mean, certainly didn't get the 1,000 we were hoping for, but it was just an incredible experience to be out there. Well, after that, we broke and we started doing, they had a bunch of demonstrations going on, some jousting and other things, and we finally got to do the battle. And the battle was really interesting. They had broken us up and, of course, put half the archers on one side, half the other, and the men-at-arms in the center, and the French lined up on the other side. Well, as we're walking into the battle, the French, of course, start catcalling to us. Which I don't know if they're telling us, you know, your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries, or exactly what they were saying, but they were all yelling at us. So, of course, we all start yelling back at them. And, of course, some of us started giving the archer salute, the two-finger salute, which the story is that this dates back to the 100 Years' War, where when the French would capture an English archer, before they would ransom him back, they would cut off those two fingers to prevent him from ever drawing a bow for his king again. So the English, prior to battle, would wave their two fingers, which is where, in theory, the V for victory came from, to show the French that they still had their fingers and they could still draw a bow for their king. Now, we all know that this is very unlikely, that it's just a story. It probably didn't happen. There are small grains of truth to the story, but it didn't stop us from still having fun and waving our fingers at the French. In fact, there's got one picture of the Italian standing next to me, stepping forward boldly, waving his fingers. And when you started looking at the people who actually showed up for the event, we ended up with, I believe there were 6 people showed up from Canada, and 2 from the United States, 1 from Argentina, and the rest were from all over Europe. So as I'm lined up in the line, I've got an Italian guy just next to me, got a bunch of Polish on the other side of him. I'm standing there with the Swedes, got an Englishman on the other side of me, it was just amazing, all the people from all the different countries that came for it. Of course, Henry, the guy playing Henry V, who looked fantastic, came around and gave his speech to us. I was really hoping he was going to give, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers speech. He didn't. He gave a good speech, but he didn't give that one. And then when we commenced the battle, there were several times during the battle that we were allowed, the archers who were armed and armored properly, which I was, we could come up and support the men at arms, which did happen in the battle. The archers, when they ran out of arrows, did drop their bows and take out their secondary weapons and run out and tackle Frenchmen. And so we had to go do that. And having done so many SCA melees, I was really interested to see how a reenactment goes, because obviously we got steel swords. We're not really going to wheel on each other, and we didn't. I mean, there was a lot of swinging swords, but you aim low, you aim for armored targets, and you might be swinging fast, but you don't swing hard. We were having a lot of fun, but it was just completely different from an SCA battle. SCA battles, we get up that close and personal, and we're knocking the stew out of each other. They weren't. They were a lot kinder and gentler to each other. But finally, when we finished the reenactment that afternoon, after the spectators left, I jumped in the car and ran over to Crécy, because I figured it was a good opportunity for a photo shoot. And it's only about 22, I think it's 22 miles or 22 kilometers or the other from the event. Managed to get over there for that. But one thing I want to say about going to a reenactment like that, if you ever have the opportunity, go. Now, of course, one of the things you always need to remember is when you go to something else, whether you go to a HEMA event or go to a reenactment, yeah, I'm SCA, but when you go there, no, you're going to be a reenactor. It's their dojo, their rules. So you have to follow their rules. You have to fit in. And I must say, the 6 of us who went and look at the pictures of us, we looked really good. You could not tell we weren't your average reenactor. In fact, we looked as well and as anybody and better than most. But wonderful experience. If you ever have a chance, go to a reenactment. Highly recommend it.
Baron, we've been spending a bit of time talking about the English warbow. At what point does a bow transition into the poundage for warbow? And then can you spend a few moments and show us or tell us how to draw that warbow?
If you really want to get a fight going on one of the longbow groups, that's an excellent question to ask, because they've been arguing that ever since, well, they've been arguing it forever. And I've read a lot of the material that came from the Mary Rose bows and the Mary Rose approximation bows. And I'm in contact with a lot of folks in the various warbow societies and their discussions on that. But really, when you look particularly at the Mary Rose bows, and it depends on whose formula you're using for calculating it, but it looks like around 100 pounds. And one of the things that you got to get up at least to 100 pounds to be able to cast an arrow that's that heavy. An English military arrow is a very heavy arrow. And the minimum distance you were required to be able to shoot that was 220 yards. And so your lighter bows, it's like my first U-bow was only 70 pounds. And it just can't get anywhere near 220 yards. So really you got to get up to at least 100 pounds. And most of the people who are shooting war bows go more than that. And I'll also mention, of course, the term warbow is a modern term. That wasn't something that was ever used in period. But yes, we in the modern times use that to distinguish your regular sporting bows from the military bows. But so about 100 pounds is the minimum that I would consider for that. As far as how to shoot one, I am far from being an expert. I've got 2 bows, one of which does qualify as a warbow. But I would highly recommend going out. There are lots and lots of videos put out by people who know far more than I do about how to shoot it. They're really good demonstrations. But when you do shoot them, one of the things you've really got to engage your back muscles. And you talk about, it's like trying to pinch an orange between your shoulder blades is how you're pulling back, because you're not going to do it with your arms. So you've got to use a bit different stance. And then when you're drawing, you're rolling the shoulder up and back. You can't just take the bow and draw it. But said, I'm far from being an expert. There are so many really good videos out there by people who are can show far better than I can how to shoot. It's something I'm really still trying to get good at, is how to do it. But it's a different stance. It's a different way you roll the shoulders and then lock to draw.
Baron, why do you think archery is so important in the SCA?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. And the first one is it's something that almost everybody can do. I mean, heavy combat or rapier or equestrian, not everybody is capable physically or really willing to get in the armor and do it. Whereas archery, almost everybody can do that. The next reason is because it's something the whole family can do. Now, I've spent many years in the society primarily as a heavy fighter. And my wife could have been a heavy fighter, but she really didn't like putting on armor. She really didn't hated wearing a helmet. It wasn't something she was going to do. And then when we got kids, our children certainly couldn't go out and fight with me on the heavy field. Whereas archery is something that we can all go do together. I mean, both of my kids started following me around. They followed me out at the archery range. I remember my daughter would sit behind me. I had a little plastic chair for her to sit behind the line, and she really wanted to shoot. And I got her a little bitty bow, a little 7-pound bow, looked like Cupid. And she'd, but every 2 weeks, she'd want to try to shoot. And I'd hand her the bow and would try. And finally, at 4 years old, she was able to draw the bow. Well, then her little brother started following us around, and he wanted to shoot too. And finally, when he turned 4, he was finally able to draw that bow. And both of them have been shooting with me. All 4 of us shoot. Both kids have won youth archery shoots. But it is really something we can all do together. The next reason is it's something that's a new person can just walk in the gate at their first event and do. Now, that's something heavy, rapier, certainly equestrian. You don't just walk in at your first event. You can't even do arts and sciences usually walk in at your first event, because it's something you have to prepare ahead of time. Archery, somebody can walk in at their first event. They can walk over to the archery range. Almost every archery marshal has plenty of loaner bows and arrows, and we usually have plenty of spare marshals lying around. We're happy to take somebody over and help them shoot. So it's just something that anybody can walk in the front door and do. The last reason is that it's also, I do living history, I do reenactment, I do SCA, and it's something, archery is something people can relate to. And like I'm doing demonstrations, and people will tend to focus and come over to archery. I mean, yeah, the armored stuff is really cool and they like that, but it's kind of hard to see themselves doing a lot of those other activities. Whereas archery, a lot of people have done archery at summer camp, and a lot of people have seen movies, Robin Hood, hopefully a good Robin Hood movie. And they've seen Brave and Hunger Games. They've seen, they can relate to a bow. It's something they can relate to. It's something they can see themselves doing. So it's a good draw for people when they come to the SCA, that they say, oh, I can do that. And then, like I said, their first event, they can walk in and do it. So really, for all those reasons, that it's something almost everybody can do. It's something the whole family can do together. A new person walking in can still do it. And it's something that people can focus on and relate to, are all the reasons I think it is just really important to the society. And it's one of the most participated things in that we have. I mean, I've been archery marshal at lots of events, and when I keep a tally of how many people participate. And when you look at the heavy combat, which is still the best, the biggest, and we're pretty competitive with rapier, but there's really nothing else that is as well attended as archery.
Baron, thanks for stopping by the tavern today and spending some time with us and talking with us about the English warbow, your experience at Agincourt and the Big Shoot, and why archery is so important in the SCA. We look forward to your return to Tavern Archery. Prost.
Prost.